Closer Than We Think was an American cartoon strip that ran from the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. In 1959, it came out with a prediction that in the near future, job hunting would be totally changed by the introduction of international job interviews. No longer confined to leafing through newspapers, men could talk via TV to employers across the world. The creator of the strip, Arthur Radebaugh, used technological trends and social dynamics of the times to come up with his vision. To understand the history of modern communication, one must trace the innovation to its roots. The first major instance of electronic communication was the telegraph, invented in the 1830s. This invention allowed parties to communicate instantly across long distances via telegraph wires using Morse code. The biggest obstacle to overcome was needing telegraph wires to be set up between every destination. The creation of the first transcontinental telegraph line was completed by the Western Union Company in 1861, and by 1866, the first permanent telegraph line was laid out across the Atlantic Ocean. This revolutionized international communication. As monumental as the telegraph was, its technological successor, the telephone, quickly overtook it in popularity. The telephone was invented in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell. The first telephone lines were installed in 1877, and within 3 years, there were nearly 50,000 telephones in operation. By 1900, there were nearly 600,000 phones in Bell's telephone system. That number shot up to 2.2 million phones by 1905 and 5.8 million by 1910. In 1915, the transcontinental telephone line began operating. As the distance telephone exchanges could cover grew, so did the technology's usefulness and influence on American life. The ability to speak in one's native language as opposed to Morse code, as well as the ability to hear the inflection in the other person's voice, made it a much more efficient form of electronic communication. Because of this, telephones boomed in popularity throughout the first half of the 20th century, and by the 1950s, they were a common staple in American households. It was even noted at the time that having telephones in the house helped allow workers to live further from their workplace with the social decentralization that instant communication allowed. This helped suburbs like the one seen in the comic grow in popularity. Through an extension of this logic, the creator of the comic could have felt that with increasing electronic communication technologies, the distance that the average worker lived from the workplace could increase too. Futuristic telephones were not the only technology showcased in the cartoon. The television is also a prominent aspect of the depicted interview. The first television was invented in the 1920s, but it was not a popular household item until after World War II. A new black and white television design came out that made the television boom in popularity in the 1950s. It became common for families to watch the television together. The shape of the television was rectangular with curved edges, the same shape as seen in the futuristic depiction. Originally, all programs were done live. Live television was more popular than taped broadcasts until the late 1950s. This means that at the time the cartoon was created, sending a video from one camera to another screen instantaneously was already common. What wasn't common was doing it on a personal level. The color TV was invented in the early 1950s, but did not become popular until the 1960s. This means that the comic predicted that color TVs would rise in popularity, as the interview is being performed on a color screen. While the technology would not have been new, the widespread use of the technology would have. In terms of individual parts, each aspect of the technologies in the comic had already been invented. Telephones and TVs were common, but the idea of using a TV-like device to communicate privately was very futuristic. The cartoon also shows how different the social roles were in the 1950s. While the technology has improved, the gender and racial roles have not in this vision of the future. Popular culture and mass media broadcast the idea that women belonged in the home as housewives. They were to perform chores and tend to the kids while the man went out and worked. This common portrayal of the American nuclear family was widespread throughout the 1950s in a variety of mediums, from telephone shows to magazine ads to full-fledged books. In this ad, the woman is being physically reprimanded by her husband for purchasing the wrong brand of coffee. This displays the level of sexism in the culture. With women in such a domesticated role, they would not have been the ones interviewing for big jobs, let alone ones on other continents. In yet another ad, the woman is seen as being there to serve her husband, not the other way around. It further ingrains the notion that women are meant to stay at home in the 1950s because they could not possibly adequately serve their husband if they also were working 40 hours a week. So in the cartoon, the wife is with her husband at the interview for aesthetic purposes, not to provide meaningful commentary. In addition to sexism running rampant in the 1950s, racism did too. The workforce was highly discriminatory against people of color. White males were the ones interviewing for most important, high-paying jobs in society, and certainly would have been the ones interviewing for the big jobs. The culmination of sexism and racism in the 1950s showed up very clearly in the cartoon. Both the interviewer and the interviewee are white, and the gender roles are clearly defined, with the wives of both men looking more like props than job seekers. From a technological standpoint, the Closer Than You Think cartoon did an excellent job predicting the future. 60 years later, Skype interviews are very common and function in very similar ways as the cartoon predicted. There is a colored computer screen with a self-facing video camera that allows both members of the interview to see each other in real time. As touched upon throughout this slidecast, the biggest way that the cartoon failed to predict the future was culturally. Today, women do much more than just stay at home. They make up 47% of the American workforce and are CEOs of some of the nation's largest corporations. All in all, using technological trends and social dynamics of the late 1950s, Closer Than You Think made an impressive look into the future of international job hunting.